From the moment Buddy Rogers won the WWF title in 1963 all the way up to the purchase of competitor WCW in 2001, Vince McMahon's sports entertainment promotion has been unburdened with the idea of featuring multiple world titles on its programming. Since then, storylines and business needs have necessitated title unification on 3 occasions. Today, we're looking at the past to inform the present, with the conclusion that WWE's current title unification situation is, well, a bad thing, on this episode of Wrestle Juice. Hey friendo, Steve here. Welcome back to Wrestle Juice. As promised, this is video 2 of a 2-part series where we're taking a look at WWE's current title unification situation. In the last video, I went and laid out some reasons as to why I think title unification is a good thing. This is going to be the other side of that particular argument, why I think title unification is a bad thing. And we're going to take a look at the past title unifications to inform us as to why that's the case. Before we get started, do me a huge favor. Click that thumbs up and hit that subscribe button, a little notify bell to make sure you're always notified when there's new Wrestle Juice stuff. And if you don't like the video, by the time it's over, you can just unclick that like button and express yourself that way. Anyways, let's dive into it, man. We're going to go back in the past. We're going to take a look at 2001. So WWE's been around since 1963 or something like that. And there's only been 3 occasions, including the most recent one, where title unification was a necessity. We're going to take a look at 2001. Of course, WCW was bought by Vince McMahon. You remember that weird Vince McMahon pose where he said, "Oh, I've got WCW, my competitor, in my hands," right? And so all of a sudden, between WCW and ECW, they had this massive roster. And the plan originally was for WWE to spin off WCW into its own promotion, into their second brand, to relieve the pressure of that roster. They felt they could still make money with WCW. Unfortunately, they couldn't really figure out the TV logistics of it. When would they run it? How would they handle the fact that SmackDown still exists? They still have all this WWE programming. How would they treat this other brand? And plus, they didn't have the big names from WCW. So long story short, it just didn't work. They were stuck with this WCW title. How do you get rid of the WCW branding? You unify the titles. That's what Chris Jericho did by beating Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock in one night at Vengeance in late 2001. They took both those titles and eventually they merged them into that one title that a bunch of people held after that. Less than a year later, because they had that huge roster, they had split the brands and they needed a second title. So Brock went to SmackDown with his unified title exclusively. At that point, the unified title became the non-unified title because they introduced that WCW title under a different name, the World Heavyweight Championship, where Triple H dominated with that title for quite a number of years. So you had title deunification. The first unification just seemed to get rid of the WCW branding until they could figure out what they were going to do. That lasted less than a year. Fast forward almost a decade, more than a decade. In December of 2013, Randy Orton and John Cena went to battle at TLC, and they unified the titles there. Randy Orton came away with both those titles. Now, if you think about what was going on then, there are 2 things that are kind of obvious. Number one, the main event scene had kind of shrunk to a reasonable number of main event level competitors. And number 2, WWE's creative, at least on the main event level, was pretty decent. They had some cool stuff going on. If you remember, that's when Daniel Bryan had his run leading into WrestleMania 30. The next year was 31, so you had Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar fighting for it, which was kind of not a great feud. But you had Seth Rollins cashing in at that WrestleMania, and his character had really come into his own. They had a lot of cool stuff going on then. Even WrestleMania 32 was a crappy WrestleMania, but the build where Triple H won it at the Rumble, I kind of personally enjoyed. And I think there was a window of time there where Roman Reigns was actually kind of over because he was doing things like punching Vince McMahon and laying out Triple H. He was actually behaving like we wanted him to behave, kind of like how he's behaving now. It was a cool 48 hours for Roman Reigns there. Anyways, back then in late 2013, early 2014, there was some cool stuff going on creatively. But what did we see in the 2.5 years between title unification and when they deunified the title again in the summer of 2016? We saw a wealth of main event level talent start to percolate to the top. You had high profile NXT call-ups like Finn Balor and Kevin Owens. You had AJ Styles entering the company. Chris Jericho came back. Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose, so all three members of the Shield, had reached sort of that upper level. You had Bray Wyatt. Brock Lesnar was still there. Randy Orton was still there. John Cena was still not necessarily full-time, but more full-time than he was in subsequent years. He was still an active competitor. And so you had, once again, way too many people to justify one title. So in 2016, when WWE realized they could start making more money off that SmackDown property, they had that change nights, go live, move to a better channel. It was just USA. They did another brand split. And because of the brand split, they had Raw pick up the Universal title or invent the Universal title. And then ever since then, we've had two brands, two titles, and the situation that we were in leading up to WrestleMania. The argument I made in the last video, of course, is during that period of time when there was two titles, be it from 2013 to 2016 or from 2002 to 2013, it was rare that we had sort of an even level playing field between those titles. But that sort of speaks to the entire point of both these videos, is that nothing's ever good unless the actual creative is good. It's dependent on consistent, solid booking with WWE. And you can't really rely on that. And so here's the case to be made for why title unification is a bad thing. WWE can't be trusted to deliver consistent, solidly good booking across the board. So if done right, title unification would involve title deunification, two world titles, would involve keeping the brands completely separate. No interplay between the brands. Survivor Series once a year would be the one time when the brands would square off, and you would need to get around the fact that it's champion versus champion, and somebody's going to look good and somebody's going to look bad. It's traditionally, oddly, Raw always wins at Survivor Series across the board, except for 2019 when NXT won. But generally speaking, Raw always comes out on the top end of that. This past year was the worst because Big E came in looking as weak as possible against Roman Reigns. They didn't even need to overbook that like they did a year before with Drew McIntyre. Number two, keep your top champions strong. This worked the best in the lead up to WrestleMania because Brock Lesnar was on Raw and he was a world beater, and you have world beater Roman Reigns on the other one. And so you can't have a situation where, for example, Jinder Mahal is your champion and he's just a chicken shit heel. I'm not a fan of chicken shit heel champions. I think they're a terrible idea. It brings everybody down. So you can't have guys like Jinder Mahal be champion. The biggest sort of thing about title unification being a bad thing, though, is that if you take a look at the past, variety is a good thing. Think back to the build to Mania 33, the one in Orlando, the one I went to and I was miserable at. You had Brock Lesnar and Goldberg in the main event scene, sort of trying not to recreate the mistakes of WrestleMania 20, that debacle in 2004. The rest of us had our eyes peeled on Bray Wyatt and Randy Orton, who were actually telling a fairly compelling story in the build to WrestleMania 33. And that story only worked because they were fighting for the WWE title. In that story, that title had actually been elevated quite a bit because of how good the story was being told. We're going to totally forget that the match itself at WrestleMania 33 was awful and involved a bunch of projections on the mat of maggots and bugs and stuff. And it was just god awful. It was terrible. But the build, the actual story where Randy Orton burned down Bray Wyatt's house, it was actually really, really cool. Everybody liked that stuff. We also had, during the WWE title on SmackDown era, AJ Styles. He had his year-long run where he was putting on great match after great match after great match. In fact, at the Royal Rumble in 2018, we had AJ Styles, Kevin Owens, and Sami Zayn in a triple threat. That being for the WWE title was mind-blowing for people who just like really, really good wrestling and really awesome characters. Meanwhile, at that same Royal Rumble, in the actual non-Rumble main event, you had Brock Lesnar, Kane, and Braun Strowman all fighting for the Universal title. Two completely different title scenes that appeal to two entirely different audiences. And there's not, I'm not saying one is better than the other, although clearly AJ Styles, Kevin Owens, and Sami Zayn is much better than Brock Lesnar, Kane, and Braun Strowman, but a case could be made for either one, I guess. You had two very different, very compelling title scenes. When booked right, it gives fans something. There's something for everybody there. Do we really need to care about which title scene to root for, or shouldn't we just root for whatever we want to root for? Ideally, when the brands are kept separate and I can pay attention to either just SmackDown or just Raw, isn't that what's best? The problem is there's too much commingling when they do that stuff. And so you get situations where they're booking a really weak champion on Raw, like Big E a couple months ago, and then you got Roman Reigns over there who's being booked to the moon on SmackDown, and then it just comes off as, well, why am I bothering watching Raw when this champion is so weak? That's just a function of bad creative. That's just bad booking right there. Right now on Raw, there is a plethora of top main event level talent that should be fighting for a WWE championship. I can't think of a better situation than Cody Rhodes, the new Edge, Seth Rollins, who's doing career work. You've got Riddle and Orton both in the tag scene, but that's going to implode at any moment, and that could be for the WWE title. And then you still got Roman doing his thing on SmackDown, which he could still just have his title. Will they do it? Won't they do it? Who knows? But that's my case for why title unification is a bad thing. WWE often needs something for people to fight over. Now on Raw this past week, I actually really enjoyed the show. I thought it was pretty good, and there were no titles to be seen whatsoever except for Austin Theory winning the US title, which again, it seems like they're elevating that mid-card title for a guy like Austin Theory. Now, where do I actually stand on this now that I've laid out reasons that seem compelling for both sides, or at least I hope they seem compelling? I'm of the opinion that right now they don't need to worry about it. Right now, Raw is actually creatively on a decent run. There's this weird thing in WWE where they can't have both shows be really good at the same time. There is a long stretch where SmackDown was pretty damn good and Raw just was awful, and now it seemed to have swung. SmackDown is just sort of there, not doing anything terribly compelling, whereas Raw is actually pretty decent, and they didn't even need the title. The bottom line is, none of it really matters if you have really good stories being told, and right now Raw has kind of a few decent stories being told. So right now, I don't think it's a problem. Will it become a problem eventually? Maybe. There's a ton of competitors on both brands right now that Roman Reigns could face off against. When will this become a problem? When Roman's title reign is stale and they haven't built anybody to the point that they can beat him. However, I think there's enough stories and enough characters that can keep his title reign interesting, if not terribly unpredictable. Because we all know he's going to keep on winning until he faces off against The Rock next year in Los Angeles. And then I guess it's anybody's game. Maybe they'll hope for like a Gable Steveson to emerge, or maybe they'll hope that they'll build Austin Theory enough to that point. Hopefully they can add a couple more wrinkles and some more dimension to his character instead of him just being the selfie guy. But my feeling is right now they don't need to worry about it, and I think I'm okay with them keeping both those titles on Roman Reigns. It's just if things start to get stale, it could make Raw or SmackDown completely unwatchable depending on where Roman is setting up shop at any given moment. Right now, don't worry about it. Worry about it when it becomes a problem, which is kind of WWE's philosophy anyways. Once things become a problem, then they fix them, or they don't. But they kind of don't worry about things until they become a problem. That's just what you're dealing with. Anyways, they're a very reactive company. Let me know what you guys think about this. Let me know your guys' thoughts. Now that you've seen both videos, you've looked at both and you've analyzed both arguments. Where do you guys stand on title unification? Just sleeping. Just knocked out. What do you do? Oh, you're awake? Oh, there's a stretch for you, Bug. Look at that belly. Are you a potbelly pig or a doggy? I can't tell. Okay. Anyways, check out one of these videos up here. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We appreciate it. Well, I'll just put the last video, the one about the good thing, in case you haven't seen that one. You can just click right over to it. Go check out also Friendo Club TV. The Enforcer and I did some My GM stuff over there from WWE 2K22. That's a lot of fun. Go check that out. We got a bunch of cool stuff over at that channel. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in one of those videos.